Welcome to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. My name is Kristen.
And my name is Katie. And we want to spend a few minutes a day with you walking through the New Testament, one chapter at a time. This year, we will fix our gaze upon Christ so that we may know him, not only with our minds, but with our hearts.
Together, we will learn that who Jesus is changes everything. Welcome back to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. My name is Kristen Schmucker, and we are journeying through the New Testament. And this is a very exciting day because today we are beginning the book of Romans. J.I. Packer, who is an author and theologian, in his book Knowing God says, all roads in the Bible lead to Romans, and all views afforded by the Bible are seen most clearly from Romans. And when the message of Romans gets into a person's heart, there is no telling what may happen. Martin Luther, best known for starting the Protestant Reformation, describes Romans as the chief part of the New Testament and truly the purest gospel. It is worth not only that every Christian should know it word for word by heart, but also that he should occupy himself with it every day as the daily bread of the soul. We can never read it or ponder over it too much, for the more we deal with it, the more precious it becomes and the better it tastes. And finally, John Piper once described Romans as the most important theological Christian work ever written. Those are some big statements. Why is Romans so beloved? Throughout Paul's epistle to the Roman church, he clearly describes the depravity of our sin, our desperate need for the gospel, and how our need for righteousness is fulfilled completely in Jesus. Paul describes how the gospel changes our lives, not just for eternity, but in the minute details of our everyday life. Paul gives us hope not just for tomorrow, but for today. As we continue studying Romans, I think we will wholeheartedly understand just why this epistle is so beloved. But before we get into the details, let's spend a moment talking about its author, Paul, and why he wrote this letter to the Roman church. Most scholars believe that Paul wrote this letter on his third missionary journey during the 3-month stay in Greece mentioned in Acts 20, verses 2 through 3. Paul had not yet met the Roman church at that point, but he wanted to. Rome was the largest city in the world at the time. Likely Jews in Rome heard of the gospel in a trip to Jerusalem and shared their faith back home. The good news spread fast, and scholars believe the Roman church was fairly large. I love that Paul says in Romans 1, 7 through 8 that he wishes to visit the Romans for mutual encouragement, not only to share the gospel there, but so that his own faith may be encouraged by his brothers and sisters in Christ. But as much as Paul longed to spend quality time with the Romans, Paul aspired to spread Jesus' name as far and as wide as he could, and that meant dreaming up journeys even beyond Rome. In Romans 15, 23 through 24, Paul tells the Romans that he desires to take the gospel to Spain, and he needs their help. Scholars believe that Paul wrote Romans to encourage the same passion for spreading the gospel that he has, so that there may be new home base for him spreading the gospel into Western Europe. But that's not the only reason. Paul also writes to address tension between Jews and Gentiles within the Roman church. We have seen tensions all through Acts between Jewish and Gentile believers, and the same is true inside the Roman church. In fact, at the time Paul pens his letter, the Roman church struggled with unity. Jewish believers were recently expelled from Rome under the reign of Claudius in AD 49. Upon their return after Claudius's death, Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians needed to reintegrate and reconcile with one another. Paul's letter to the Romans is not only functional, it's a letter of reconciliation. Paul will communicate throughout Romans that both Jews and Gentiles, and in fact all people, have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and therefore all people need Jesus. In fact, this is what the first few chapters of Romans are all about, the problem of sin impacting every person and how the gospel is the solution. Paul knows the solution, the medicine to the sickness of the ailing world, and that solution has a name, Jesus. This is the gospel. Paul is not ashamed of this, as he boldly says in verse 16, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile. For in the gospel the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last. Just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. Only through Jesus can anyone become righteous, not by our own works, how many times we have attended church, or how many small groups we've led. The Jews could not earn this righteousness by perfectly keeping the law. Our faith in Jesus is the only thing that grants us righteousness, and it's not even our own. Jesus' righteousness becomes ours. In the latter half of Romans 1, Paul vividly paints a picture of the problem, a world far from God. Paul echoes the sentiments of David in Psalm 19, 1-4. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the expanse proclaim the works of his hands. Day after day they pour out speech, night after night they communicate knowledge. There is no speech, there are no words, their voice is not heard. Their message has gone out to the whole earth, and their words to the ends of the world. In the heavens he has pitched a tent for the sun. God's creation worships God as creator. God made himself known, but people reject him. They choose to worship creation over creator, and so God gave them over to their desires. Disordered worship distorted God's good design for humanity. Paul spares no shortage in language describing the depravity of man. People became sexually impure. They were wicked and greedy and boastful. Verse 31 says they have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. They not only do shameful things, but they encourage them in the culture. Paul describes a world very in need of saving. If you're like me, I can be quick to read a list like this and think, wow, that describes the world we live in today. We look at modern culture and see sin being celebrated and evil being justified. We can quickly other ourselves. But as we will read tomorrow, no one is exempt from the need for Jesus. From chapter 1 through chapter 4, Paul will continue to explain the problem of sin and how God has answered with himself by sending his son Jesus to be righteous on our behalf. Jesus is the antithesis of the sin-soaked world Paul describes. Jesus was never wicked. He is merciful. He was never evil. He is compassionate. He was never greedy. He is generous. He never had a depraved thought or action, but was wholly loyal to the Father. Jesus was the perfect human, and yet he died a shameful death on the cross. Also, we could receive his righteousness and finally gain what we really need, the presence of God. As we study Romans 1, we behold Jesus as the man whom the whole world needs. We see the sins Paul lists, and we take an honest look in the mirror and remind ourselves that we need him too. May we behold Christ as we study Romans and be filled with gratitude that God saved us despite us, that God loved us despite our inability to love him. May we be filled with the same zeal Paul hopes for the Romans, the zeal that prompts us to make Christ known in every corner of our lives.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. Don't forget to check out the show notes for helpful links and resources related to today's episode. And make sure you are following at Daily Grace Podcast on Instagram for more A Year in the Bible content, and at the Daily Grace Co. for all things Bible study resources. We can't wait to study again with you tomorrow. Bye, friends.